Okay, so good evening to one and all. As I mentioned, we'll be talking about genetic engineering for enhancing ethanol production from lignocellulosic biomass. So this will be the major outline of my talk. I will give a brief introduction about our R&D center, and I'll talk about the need for biofuels and about the whole process of 2G ethanol production, the role of genetic engineering in the ethanol production process, and the challenges associated with this strategy. So coming on to the introduction, Hindustan Petroleum Corporation Limited is one of the Government of India companies which is engaged in oil refining. There are three main companies: Indian Oil, Bharat Petroleum, and Hindustan Petroleum. So Hindustan Petroleum is now a Maharatna company. It is having Forbes 2000 status, and it is having two major refineries in Mumbai and Visakhapatnam. And it also has two refineries in collaboration with Mittal Energy and Mangalore Refinery and Petrochemicals Limited. So in addition to the two refineries, HPCL also has the second largest share of product pipelines in India, and it has a huge marketing network consisting of 21 zonal offices and around 128 regional offices. Coming now to the R&D center. R&D center is established in Bangalore. It was originally established in 2012 in a shed kind of a thing, and now in 2016 we have moved into the present campus, which is located near Devangonthi. And this is an aerial view of our present campus, the one below. And totally, it is built up over an area of 104 acres. And as part of phase one, we have around 7 labs, which are mainly focusing on crude evaluation and fuel research, analytical studies, FCC. This is again a refinery process, hydroprocessing for upgradation of crude oil, catalysis, bioprocess, and nanotechnology. And in a phase 2, which is presently undergoing, we will be having 3 more labs which will be dedicated to petrochemicals, tribology or lube research, and battery and engine research. So our main focus of HPGRDC is to develop technologies for refineries. And in addition, we also provide technical support to refineries in terms of evaluation of catalyst, evaluation of processes, and further processes to improve separation efficiency, etc. And we also engage in collaborative research with academic institutions. So, and we undertake some kind of basic research. So most of the research is allied with what is required as far as refineries are concerned. But in addition, we also do a significant amount of collaborative research where we interact with academic institutes. So if we talk about the thrust areas of our research, mainly we are into refinery technologies and their improvement, valorization of low value streams, novel separations, process intensification, and majorly we are now into renewable energy as also. We are mainly focusing on biofuels as well as solar energy over here. Again, coming to this, this is the aerial view as it looks kind of impressive. And these are some of the photographs of some of our pilot plants, which are already running and fully utilized. And so far we have filed around 115 patents. So as I said, the R&D center was established in 2016. And as of 2020, we already have 115 patents, out of which 55 have already been granted. And we have around 14 technologies which have been demonstrated at the refinery scale, and around 9 products also. So some of these are HP high gas technology for process intensification, diesel lubricity additive. So now as we are going into Euros BS6 kind of fuel specifications, we need additives to improve the diesel properties. So these are some of the additives which we are working on. So that was about the introduction about R&D center. Coming now to the need for biofuels. So this is kind of, everybody knows what the need is. We cannot continuously depend upon fossil fuels for a very long time. So if we look at the evolution of energy resources, so initially, if you look at this graph, initially at around 1800 and all, the energy source was completely fuel wood kind of an energy source. And gradually around 1900, coal began to be explored as an energy source. And around the middle of the 19th century is when people started to discover the importance of oil. And oil, it is such a good energy source that even now we are still depending mainly for a significant amount of time on oil. Later on, by around 1970s and all, natural gas was also discovered as a source of electricity. And now from post-2000 new age of energy sources in which we're talking about electric vehicles and all these kind of things are coming post-2000. So this is how energy sources are evolving. But even then, if you look at this graph, up to 2100 itself, I mean, the oil, there is no decline in the period of oil. And unfortunately, if you look at India's scenario, around 90% of our oil reserves are based upon imports from other countries. And therefore, the government has a mandate to kind of become sustainable in energy, and therefore there is a great thrust on renewable energy. As part of this initiative, government is having more and more focus on solar energy, nuclear energy, and now in the area also of biofuels. So, so what are the advantages of having biofuels? First of all, biofuel is any kind of fuel which can be derived from any kind of agricultural biomass. India being an agricultural country, we have surplus biomass in our country. And if we can use it for producing some kind of biofuel or bioproducts, this will have minimal impact on the environment, and it will also produce a lot of rural employment. And when we're talking about biofuels, I'm mainly referring to ethanol over here and butanol. And as part of this initiative, so this initiative is happening in 2 or 3 different ways. We have a lot of agricultural institutes which are trying to develop crops which will be easily deconstructed. And then we also have a lot of research institutes and companies which are working on the areas which are involved in biomass breakdown and also in biofuel bioproduct synthesis. In line with all this, a national biofuel policy was formulated in 2018 by the Government of India, in which we now have to blend around 20% ethanol in petrol and 5% biodiesel blending in diesel by 2030. So as of now, the petrol which we are getting in our petrol pumps and all our retail outlets, it is having around 4% ethanol. The task is to now take it up to 20%. So at present, whatever ethanol we are getting, that is mainly derived from food crops. It is mainly derived from sugarcane and sugarcane. But then if you want to take it up to 20% ethanol throughout the country, we really do not have that much of sugarcane available in our country. And therefore, there is a need to now move on to other sources of biomass. And therefore, the now focus is on using agricultural residue, agricultural waste like rice straw, wheat straw, sugarcane, bagasse, etc., which are available in plenty and which are available in a considerable amount throughout the year and which are relatively cheap also. So coming now to 2G ethanol. So 2G ethanol specifically involves utilizing agri residues, which are waste products for the production of ethanol. So this helps to solve that food versus fuel debate. And one of the major reasons why government is starting to focus on this is because up to 20% ethanol blending can be done in petrol without any engine modifications. So if you're going to be blending 20% ethanol in your petrol, you are actually going to be reducing your petrol demand by 20%, and therefore you are going to be saving a lot of money in terms of the money spent in importing crude oil. And as we know that gradually more and more urbanization is happening, so fuel demand will keep on increasing. There is no way it is going to decrease. So therefore, as we have limited fossil fuel reserves, we have to look at other ways. And this is one way in which we can gradually become self-sufficient in our energy needs. And moreover, it will generate a lot of jobs in the rural sector. So these are all the advantages due to which the government is promoting 2G ethanol, and due to which a lot of research is also happening in academic as well as industrial sectors related to 2G ethanol. So if I come now to give an overview of the whole process. So lignocellulosic biomass is mainly composed of cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin. Cellulose is usually containing around 34 to 50% is the content of this biomass. It is a crystalline polymer of glucose, and it is very difficult to hydrolyze chemically. And however, it is susceptible to enzymatic attack by cellulases. The hemicellulose is a heteropolymer of pentose and hexose. Pentoses stand for C5 sugars, and hexose is like glucose. It is having a lot of substitution, a lot of acetylation, etc. happens in the hemicellulose, and it is comparatively easier to depolymerize as compared to cellulose. And the third component of biomass is lignin. This is having a very complex aromatic structure, and mainly lignin is what contributes to the mechanical integrity of the plant. So the lignin is what imparts the structural integrity to the whole plant, and it prevents the hydrolysis. Lignin and hemicellulose, they form a network to protect the cellulose and protect it from further hydrolysis. So these are the components of biomass. And if we now look at the overall process of 2G ethanol production, so the first step, so you have cellulosic feedstock will be any kind of grassy material, any kind of plant material. The next thing to do is, so this is what usually it looks like. There is an outer lignin layer, and inside we have cellulose and hemicellulose. So the first goal is to do something called as a pre-treatment. This is usually a high temperature, high pressure step in which that lignin layer is broken down and the cellulose and hemicellulose are depolymerized. This is the first step of the pre-treat of the 2G process. In the second step, we look at cellulose and hemicellulose. These are essentially polymers. They have to be broken down into their individual sugars. And this is called as hydrolysis. This can be done by chemical route or enzymatic route. I will come to this later. And in the last step, we have fermentation, in which the monomeric sugars are actually converted into ethanol. And this ethanol is then distilled out by typical distillation processes, and then it can be used for blending into petrol and used in cars as shown over here. So now each of these steps I will take in little more detail. So biomass pre-treatment. So this, as I mentioned, is the first step in which that lignin layer is disrupted. So this is these are some photographs from our lab. So initially, if you see any rice straw, wheat straw kind of material, it will be usually 2 meters in length. So it's some kind of size reduction has to be done, because as we all know, the smaller the size, greater the surface area. So better will be your interaction with your catalyst. So there are different. So as you make it smaller and smaller, you will have high surface area, and the reaction will be more efficient. So here, if you see, we have sizes from 20 millimeter or 2 centimeter, and down we have gone up to 500 microns. So these are the four. This is what we can achieve in our lab using conventional equipment, but there are even more advanced equipment where we can do even finer sizing. When we do finer sizing, what we see is we get better conversion, but at the same time, as we go on making the size finer, the energy required for sizing correspondingly goes on increasing. So as you see over here, as you decrease the size, your energy requirement goes up. And this is a very difficult balance to achieve. So we really need to find out the optimum at which both can be managed in a manageable way. Coming now to pre-treatment. Pre-treatment can be chemical, physical combined. So chemical pre-treatment, so as I said, this lignin is a very rigid structure. A lot of high temperature, high pressure has to be given to disrupt that layer. And therefore, people have used catalysts to lower that activation energy, and people have used acids, alkalines, organic solvents, ionic liquids, etc. This all come under chemical pre-treatment. And in terms of physical, is like this kind of sizing. You go on even further sizing. You use processes like extrusion, microwave, ultrasound, etc. And these are the different processes. This is essentially a very energy-intensive process. At the end of this process, what you get is liquid. Liquid will usually have the hemicellulose component, and the solids will be rich in cellulose. So this is the first step called biomass pre-treatment. In the next step, we have something called as enzymatic hydrolysis. Here, what happens is these cellulose polymers, they have to be broken down. Now, cellulose is a polymer of glucose, but there is extensive hydrogen bonding within cellulose, because of which it is very difficult to break. And therefore, many enzymes are required to break open this cellulose chain. So for example, if you see in this diagrammatic representation, you have around three major classes of enzymes. You have something called as cellobiohydrolases, which essentially cut towards the end of the chains. And then you have this green, which is endoglucanase, which cuts in the middle of the chain. Both these enzymes, that is cellobiohydrolases and endoglucanases, these two act in synergy to form two glucose units, which are called as cellobios, which you can see over here. And this cellobiose is further broken down into individual glucose units by enzyme called as beta glucosidases, which is shown over here in red. So these are the three major classes of cellulases which are involved in this whole process. And in addition, a lot of accessory enzymes are also required, which help to hold the substrate together, which help in swelling of the cellulose fiber, etc. So a concerted action of several enzymes is required for enzymatic hydrolysis, and this is one area where genetic engineering a lot of genetic engineering is being done. The previous pre-treatment step is a purely physical or chemical process. There is no intervention of genetic engineering in that area. Coming now to the third step in the process, which is fermentation. Fermentation is essentially a very standardized process in which basically glucose is taken up by yeast cells. usually bacteria or yeast, glucose, and under anaerobic conditions, it is converted into ethanol via this process. Glucose is converted to pyruvate through glycolysis, and then from pyruvate is converted to ethanol using by alcohol dehydrogenase enzyme. And this happens in a bioreactor under controlled conditions. This is again diagrammatic representation of what a bioreactor looks like. Here, temperature, pH, etc., are maintained under fixed conditions, and we can provide optimum conditions for microbes to grow and convert this glucose into ethanol, which can then be distilled out. So this is again the biological process of the whole of this entire step. So enzymatic hydrolysis and fermentation, these are the two biological steps of this 2G process, and here is where genetic engineering is of use. So genetic engineering is again genetic engineering can be of as the name suggests, it is mainly some kind of manipulation of the genetic material. So genetic material, as we all know, there are mainly 4 nitrogenous bases. There is adenine, thymine, guanine, and cytosine. And these 4 bases, the combination, the order in which these are arranged in the sequence is what makes us different from monkeys or rats, or even among each other also. Whatever differences there is because of this order in which these 4 bases are arranged. So, so the simplicity of the code, so technically speaking, it is very simple because only 4 bases are there. But then the complexity is also there that all the organisms, all plants, all microorganisms, all animals, everybody has the same 4-base genetic code. And in spite of that, there is so much of variation. So that is the complexity of this whole process. Now, genetic engineering means modifying this code so as to improve or make something bad, depending upon what your intention is. As far as our application is concerned, we are trying to make better enzymes. We are trying to make better strains. So, this can be done by 3 approaches. There is something called as a targeted genetic engineering, and then there is a random genetic engineering and evolutionary genetic engineering. I will cover each of these in detail. So, targeted genetic engineering is specifically means when you know what is the organism, which is the gene you want to target. So usually, as far as I said, in the enzymatic hydrolysis step, this is very critical. So as enzymatic hydrolysis, as I mentioned, there are 3 major classes of enzymes. Now, typically, enzymes are produced by fungi as well as bacteria. And most of the commercial enzymes which are used for 2G applications, they are actually produced by fungi, especially like Trichoderma, Penicillium, etc. These are normally present in the soil, but the ones which are used for commercial applications, obviously they are much more advanced, much more improved in terms of their protein production profile. So usually what happens is these fungus which is there in the soil, it tries to it secretes or it secretes out these kind of proteins because cellulose is insoluble. As you may be knowing, it is insoluble. So this organism has to secrete cellulases, so as to hydrolyze this material. So usually it grows on wood and this kind of material. So these enzymes are secreted out to hydrolyze this material, and the sugars which are produced, those are taken up by the cell for their growth and multiplication, etc. So enzymatic hydrolysis is a favorite target for genetic engineering. Why? Because there are 3 main classes of enzymes and a lot of accessory enzymes. And usually in our lab, we have done like extensive isolation and screening. We have collected around 2,000 fungal strains from different parts of South India. And we have tried to screen for that enzyme production ability. And we have seen that hardly out of those 2,000, maybe 10 or 20 only are good. Most of them are average producers. So then how do people make commercial enzyme out of this? So people have made it by genetic engineering. So by genetic engineering, you improve the DNA, you improve the organism so that it starts to make much higher levels of these enzymes. And then these can be used for whatever application. So in the case of 2G ethanol, there are only 2 companies which are making enzymes for 2G applications. One is Novozymes, which is a Denmark-based company, and one is DuPont, which is an American company. So both these, so there are only 2 suppliers in the world. And because of, obviously, you can imagine the costs will be very high. And in fact, the whole 2G ethanol process, it is said that around 25 to 30% of the cost of the whole process is because of these enzymes only. And And therefore, since India is also trying to develop its own 2G ethanol technology and trying to become self-sufficient, we cannot really spend so much of money on importing these enzymes. And that is why the emphasis on trying to develop our own enzymes for such applications. Another area where we can do genetic engineering is in the fermentation pathway. So as I said, glucose fermentation, I showed you a couple of slides back. So glucose fermentation is very standard. So glucose fermentation is I hope you're able to see the screen. I think some
Yes,
disconnection is
Yeah, ma'am.
okay, fine. Okay, so this glucose fermentation is a very standard process. Most organisms are able to do this. But one more important component of biomass is hemicellulose, which constitutes around 30% of the biomass. And hemicellulose is essentially a polymer of C5 sugars. Mainly, it is a polymer of xylose and arabinose. So all these conventional yeast strains, they are not able to metabolize this. They're not able to metabolize xylose because they do not have that pathway. So therefore, people have tried to incorporate the xylose utilization pathway into these yeast so that C5 sugars can also be utilized. So by this way, if both C5 and C6 sugars of biomass can be utilized, we can get around 220 to 230 liters of ethanol per ton of biomass, per ton of rice straw at least. And again, there are two pathways for xylose utilization. One is called as a xylo XR-XDH pathway, in which essentially xylose is reduced to xylitol, and then it is reduced further to form D-xylulose, and which is then phosphorylated to form D-xylulose phosphate, which is converted to ethanol. Another pathway is an XI pathway, which is a xylose isomerase pathway. This is usually found in many bacteria, this pathway, in which xylose is directly converted to xylulose and then phosphorylated, and then it goes into ethanol production. So these are the two pathways which are there in some yeast and many bacteria, whereas normal brewing yeast like Saccharomyces does not have this pathway. So people are trying to incorporate this pathway into the yeast. So if you talk about targeted genetic engineering, what are the approaches people are usually doing? So most of the, so if you go into the, if I come back to this slide, so the rate limiting step in this reaction is usually the activity of cellobiohydrolases, because this usually cuts at the end and it creates fragments on which other enzymes can act. So cellobiohydrolase is this blue one over here. This is a rate limiting one. It is usually produced in smaller quantities and activity is lower usually. So this is the rate limiting step. And another rate limiting step is the beta glucosidase. Only if beta glucosidase is active will you actually have free glucose units, which can then be taken up for ethanol production. So these are the two enzymes which are usually rate limiting, and people have tried to selectively overexpress these enzymes. So overexpression of these enzymes means introducing an additional copy of these genes into the host organism. So host organism will usually be some kind of fungi like Trichoderma or Penicillium, and we introduce additional copies of this gene through genetic engineering. Another common target is overexpression of regulatory genes. Now the cellulose, so as if I come back to the previous slide once again, as you see over here, I have shown only 3 cellulases, and again these are 3 families. In each family there are many more. So there are in each family there are at least 6 or 7 more of enzymes, and plus you have a lot of accessory enzymes. So typical enzyme producing strains like Penicillium, they usually have around 50 to 60 proteins which participate in cellulose hydrolysis. So you can easily imagine that if 50 to 60 proteins are being expressed, then it is a very complicated process, and accordingly the regulation process will also be just as complicated. So therefore there are many proteins which are also involved in the regulatory aspect. And you must have heard about positive regulators and negative regulators. So the idea is if you increase the positive regulation, it will do positive feedback and it will help to increase the expression of these genes. So this is another target. What people have done is overexpression or increased expression of positive regulatory genes like XYR1 or ACE3. These are the two known factors which we know about as of now. And similarly, there will be negative regulatory genes also. So if you remove the negative regulatory gene, the enzyme activity can be increased. So there is, so the one commonly known one is CRE1, and others are still being identified. So not much of research has happened on Trichoderma as compared to say Saccharomyces or E. coli. So E. coli genome has been well studied maybe 30, 40 years back. So we know everything about that organism, and that is why E. coli is used as a lab strain for any kind of genetic engineering activity. The same kind of uh, research is not available for these fungal strains. So as of now, we know of these three regulators, and major genetic engineering focus is in this area. Another point is site-directed mutagenesis. Here, what happens is, so again, it is about, so these previous ones were about completely replacing or introducing a new gene. Site-directed mutagenesis is in which you know certain sites which are part of the active enzyme of the complex. So there will be, so every enzyme, enzymes, as we all know, they will have an active site in which the substrate will go and bind. So there will be some amino acids in the active site of the enzyme which actually interact with your substrate. So if you change those active sites, then your enzyme activity can be increased or decreased. Another thing is all these fungal proteins, they have some kind of post-translational modification. That is, after the RNA, after the protein is made, after the protein is synthesized, some kind of glycosylation, etc., happens in which carbohydrate groups like mannose and all are added. This is mainly done for increasing the stability of the protein, but sometimes this also is known to interfere with the activity. So we can actually change the position in which this glycosylation is done so that we can achieve higher, more active enzymes. Another area of interest is fusion proteins, in which fusion proteins in which instead of having multiple, so we know that there are three major classes of enzymes. So instead of putting all the three together, what we can do is we can try to make a longer protein in which active site of one and active site of one more are clubbed together. So these are more of academic studies. These kind of things are not actually being done at a plant scale. This is more of academic studies and for research publication. And the last is promoter engineering. This is a very important area. So promoter is the promoter is a gene sequence which is upstream of the actual gene. So the advantage of the promoter actually decides how tightly your RNA polymerase will bind to the promoter and how much of mRNA will actually be made in the cell. And the amount of mRNA which will be made will ultimately decide the amount of protein which is made in the cell. And naturally, the amount of protein which is there in the cell will decide how efficient your strain is in terms of hydrolyzing your biomass. So changing the promoter or altering the promoter is this is a very tricky thing, because promoter sequences are not very well defined. But this is an area which is having tremendous potential, because changing the promoter sequence can actually have wide-ranging effects, because the promoter of one can often be used to control the expression of other genes as well. So these are some of the areas in which targeted genetic engineering is of use. Another area which is commonly used is something called as a random genetic engineering. This, as we know, so in the previous in this, what we know what we want to do. So that is called as targeted. Random genetic engineering, as the name clearly suggests, we do not know what we want to do. We have an objective in mind, but how to reach there, we are not very sure. So what we do over here is we essentially mutate the DNA by either physical agents like UV or gamma rays, or by chemical agents like ethidium bromide, acridine orange, ethyl methane sulfonate, NTG, etc. So what usually happens is these chemical agents, these are mutagenic in nature. These chemical agents, they can, for example, in this image over here, I have shown the mechanism of action of EMS. So EMS is an alkylating agent. So when it interacts with, say, guanine, it alkylates if an ethyl group is added to the guanine and to form at the O6 position. And this is therefore, and this one is then not able to form the normal base pairing that is usually observed in the DNA. So for example, we know that ATGC, so A and T interact with 2 bonds, C and G interact with 3 bonds. So this But when you have this kind of alkylation kind of thing, then this bonding is interfered with, and then this bonding is interfered with, and then eventually when this DNA strand replicates, that change will be carried over, and subsequently over a period of time this base will eventually get removed from the sequence itself. So these are kind of permanent changes which happen in the genomic DNA of the organism. Now this, as the name suggests, random genetic engineering, we do not know where this change will happen. What we do is we treat the organism with these kind of chemical agents, and the change may actually happen in any area of the genome. So it may have positive effect, as in it may increase the enzyme activity, or sometimes it may have negative effect also. So that is the side effect of doing a random genetic engineering approach, because we do not know exactly where the mutation will happen. Uh, and then coming to the last type of genetic engineering, which is evolutionary genetic engineering. So evolution, the whole process of evolution itself is a type of genetic engineering. If we try to, if you try to study the theory of Charles Darwin's natural selection and all those, you see the way those beaks of the birds have evolved over a period of time, depending upon their food habits, or the way the pattern of coloration of these insects have changed over the years. These are all, this has happened over millions of years, and actually if you compare the genetic sequence of the original and the present one, you will actually see that there is a difference in the genome sequence. So this is also some type of genetic engineering. It is happening over evolution, but in the nature it happens over a very long time. But in the lab we can do we also do laboratory type adaptive evolution, in which we can reduce this time duration to a very significant extent. So what we do over here in our lab, mainly we do this in terms of for C5 fermentation aspect. So usually what happens is when we are doing this biomass pre-treatment, the C5 sugar which is there, it gets dehydrated to form what is called as furfural. So furfural is a very toxic compound, and most organisms are not able to metabolize this compound, and they are not able to grow in the presence of this. But as I said, if you are able to convert C5 sugars to ethanol, our whole ethanol product titer will be very high. We can get almost 220 liters of ethanol per ton of biomass. Uh, so fermentation of C5 is very important, but then the problem is the presence of this furfural. So what we do over here is we grow the organisms in gradually increasing concentration. So this image over here, it kind of shows the way in which the as the color increases, as the color becomes more intense, your concentration of the molecule, like here furfural, is gradually increasing. So for example, we allow the organism to grow without furfural for say maybe 5 to 10 generations. After that, we move it into a medium which is having slightly higher, like say 2 millimolar furfural, and then gradually we keep on increasing. So the idea is, as you go on increasing the concentration of these toxic compounds, a process of natural selection will happen, and the fittest cells will be selected, and they will divide, and then they will propagate eventually. So by the time you have you reach to this stage, you will actually have 90% of the cells will be tolerant to this toxic chemical. And later, and then usually what people do is they do a whole genome sequence to see where the change has happened, because here again this is not in our control. Naturally the organism is responding to this kind of stress, and some changes are happening at the genetic level, which we are now utilizing for our own benefit. Again, this can be a little time-consuming process, because the strain is naturally adapting, and there are ways to which we can enhance. And this is something which we in our lab at R&D Center in Bangalore, we are working in all three areas of genetic engineering. So coming now to the challenges, I'm almost at the last slide. So why this process is taking so long? Why do we still not have an enzyme? Why are we still depending on Novozymes for the complete enzyme? So there are several issues associated with this process. First of all, the filamentous fungi, they're very difficult to genetically engineer, mainly because the genome information is not complete. As I said, E. coli has been very well studied since last 30-40 years. E. coli is very well known. Every aspect of its genome is researched, and we all know what all is there. Similarly, Saccharomyces also, because these two organisms are so well known, almost all the genetic engineering tools and literature, everything is based on these two organisms. But when we talk about organisms like Trichoderma penicillium, these are still not yet fully studied, and there are several regions of the genome which we are not yet aware about, because of which we cannot do a proper genetic engineering job. Another problem with fungi is they have a complex protein secretion. First of all, in the whole cellulose hydrolysis process, as I said, 30 to 40 or 50 proteins also may be involved. And further, it is having different types of glycosylation. So there is N-glycosylation, there is O-glycosylation, and there are several other modifications, acetylation, methylation. Several modifications are happening, which do not happen in, say, E. coli or Saccharomyces. And one more critical thing is methods of DNA transfer are not well standardized. For example, in the case of E. coli, we have the typical heat shock method in which, so this is very well standard. So labs all over the world, and maybe you people in your practicals also, you may have done this heat shock method in which DNA is DNA is allowed to be taken into E. coli cells by simply putting at 42 degrees for some time. So for E. coli and Saccharomyces, these are very well standardized. But when we talk about Trichoderma penicillium, etc., these methods are still not well standardized, and a lot of work has to be done. So there are 2 or 3 processes. There is an electroporation process which is shown over here, in which a high voltage electric pulse is given, which creates spore in the membrane, and through which the DNA can go in. And another type of method is an agrobacteria mediated method. This is again a separate session in itself, but this is an overview of the process. This itself is a very complicated process, and it is having its own challenges. So this is a brief of the agrobacteria mediated method. Essentially, the agrobacterium itself, the bacterial strain itself can act as a vector. It can help to transport the DNA, and it can help to infect plant or fungal cells. Another problem is limited number of selection markers. So if you want to do, you may have studied about basic genetic engineering. So whenever any gene, whenever you're doing any kind of recombinant DNA technology, one of the key things is how to select for your modified things. So usually people use antibiotic markers. So if your organism is growing on an antibiotic plate, it means that it is having recombinant, that it is a recombinant, it is having foreign DNA. So in the case of bacteria, there are several antibiotics which can be used, but in the case of fungi, there are only 3 or 4. So that kind of limits the number of the amount of genetic engineering that can be done to one strain. And further, no well-characterized host. This is similar to my previous point. Like for example, in the case of E. coli, you have strains which are recombinase negative, and you have strains which are known for high protein production, which are for various applications. Several E. coli strains are available, but the same is not available for, say, Trichoderma or penicillium. So these are the challenges associated with filamentous fungi, and of course, the other challenges are there that about regulatory issues. For example, in our country, we are not allowed to use genetically modified organisms at a larger scale, at more than 10-liter level, because they can come into the environment and we do not know what they may cause. And most well-characterized strains, like say Trichoderma rhizii, RUT-C30, these are proprietary in nature, and they are available with certain companies, and they are not available for academic research. So we do not know exactly what all change has happened in those organisms. Then developing a process for fungal fermentation, that is again a big challenge, because what happens is this fungus, it does not grow like I'm not sure if you have actually seen the fungal fermentations. So this fungal, it grows in the form of a kind of a mat-like structure. So it is forming thread or mat-like structure, and it is not suspended properly like bacteria. So it is difficult to control the growth. And similarly, and one more thing is the substrate which are used, they are insoluble in nature. So like cellulose, wood, rice straw, etc. These are all insoluble in nature. So again, how to manage these things at a larger scale is a very big challenge. So these are some of the issues associated with genetic engineering, which people are trying to address across the globe. And we in our R&D center also, we are trying our best to work on each of these areas. We are trying to develop our own enzymes. We're trying to develop our own strains for fermentation. And the way forward will be a greater understanding about the regulatory pathways involved, developing a standard process for fungal transformation. So with every strain, we need to optimize the process for agrobacterium or electroporation or whatever. And developing of strains with improved C5, C6 fermentation, developing of consolidated bioprocessing strains. So consolidated bioprocessing, this is a very interesting approach in which the same organism is able to produce enzymes as well as it can also ferment. So the advantage of this is the enzymes part is very costly, and that is mainly adding to the cost. Whereas here, if you take this kind of strain, you will be having your own strain which is able to produce enzyme as well, and this can considerably reduce the cost. But again, there is a lot of R&D involved in this, and a lot of people are working. Let us hope for the best. So this again brings me to this is the last slide of my presentation. This is some of the facilities in our lab. This is our fermentation lab. And this image on the right, this is the pilot plant. We have a 1 KL 1,000-liter fermentation facility in our lab, where we are able to scale up from. So in our lab, we have the capacity to scale up fermentations from, say, 3 liter to 1,000 liters. So all the facility we have for this, and we are actively trying to come up with solutions for all these problems of 2G ethanol, so that we are able to develop a technology. With this, I know I have rushed a lot. I have come to the end of my presentation. Since we were running late, I have tried my best to finish on time. Thank you so much for the patient listening, and I'll be ready to take any questions now. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am, for your informative session. Now we will be moving to the Q&A. Chitra will be handling it. Over to you, Chitra.
Shall I start, ma'am?
Yeah, please start. Yeah.
What do you think is the main hurdle in implementing such transitions from conventional to bio-based source of fuel? How this might change in the future?
So the main so conventional fuels, as in, I think you're referring to crude oil based fuels. So crude oil, first of all, crude oil is a limited resource. We do not have access to much crude oil, and therefore we need to move into other fuels. So the main hurdle is, as I said, the pre-treatment part is a big hurdle, because the pre-treatment is the first step of the bio-based source of fuel. So pre-treatment, if we develop a good pre-treatment process, which is able to, then all the downstream processes will be handled smoothly. So this is the main hurdle and of course the other main hurdle is that water content. So conventional fuels like crude oil, there is no water content, so all your chemical processes happen smoothly, whereas in the case of bio-based source of fuel, water content will be very high. This is something we have to deal with, and the presence of water and oxygen, it kind of reduces the efficiency of all chemical processes. But this is something we cannot do anything about it, because we have to deal with the biomass which is available. Yes. So can we move on to the next question?
Okay, ma'am. Even though mixing all fuels with ethanol may be a boon for India, many reports say that it could strain the country's water resources and affect food availability. Is that true?
Okay, so I want to clarify over here that it will not strain the country's water resources, because whatever ethanol plants we're talking about total water recycling. So whatever water, so definitely this is a water intensive process. A lot of water is required for pre-treatment, enzymatic hydrolysis, etc. But then what happens is, after your fermentation, there is a distillation step for recovering your ethanol. And at that stage, we also recover all the water back, and that water is recycled and used for the next cycle. So whatever plants are going to be set up, they will all be having 100% water recycling. So therefore, water resources, it will not particularly affect. And food availability, again, it will not affect, because we are not talking about sugarcane right now. We are talking about rice straw, wheat straw, any kind of agri residue, all your dry leaves, cotton stalk, etc., which are not food stock, which are not as acting as food for the people. Okay.
In countries like Brazil, automakers use flex fuel engines. How do the vehicles run with absolute ethanol or commercial gasoline together without any problems?
Okay, so this is a very good question actually. So in countries like Brazil, they are having modified engines. So as I said, up to with existing conventional engines, we can go up to 20% ethanol blending. Beyond that, we cannot go, because further ethanol is associated with corrosive. It is corrosive in nature, in the sense ethanol in the presence of whatever catalysts are there and all, it will get converted to some amount of acetic acid, etc., which can be corrosive to your engine parts. So therefore, Going beyond 20% ethanol will not make much sense. But in Brazil, whatever, they have totally modified their engines, which is why the engines are running on 100% ethanol. Yes.
Let us take a case where we are able to genetically engineer a microorganism of interest. Now, how do we maintain its quality for a longer period of time?
Okay, so any kind of genetically engineered organism. If you're talking about targeted genetic engineering, it will be having some kind of antibiotic selection markers. So as long as we maintain that selection pressure, that gene will always be there. So maintaining of a genetic engineering strain is not that difficult. It usually happens. It usually happens. We keep subculturing, and there are several ways in which we can do quality check and quality control. We can look at every time before starting a batch, we can look at the integrity of the strain, and we can proceed. So that is not so difficult.
Does the order of nucleotides decide the type of organisms? Genome size differs in organisms, right?
Yes, the genome size differs in organisms, and the number of, but you would be surprised to know that onions and that we think that humans are superior because of our genome size, but actually there are several other organisms which have a bigger genome size. So it is not only the size of the genome, it is also the nature in which the sequence in which those genes are present, which really matter. So the sequence of the nucleotides decides the type of microorganisms, and so this is a very controversial question. You can say sequence, and sequence in turn decides the size. So yeah, we can keep debating upon this actually. But yeah.
Okay, ma'am. Next question. Is the ethanol production economical? As compared to the input, is the amount of output good enough?
Okay, so the output. So we have a limitation on the bioresources that only around 50 to 55% of the biomass, or like any rice straw, wheat straw, is having carbohydrate component, and only this 55% of material is available for ethanol production. So technically, around only 50% of the biomass will be used for ethanol production. So as of now, we are able to achieve that. But again, it is a very cost-intensive process, because that first step which I talked about, pre-treatment, that requires high temperature and high pressure. So it is energy-intensive process, and the enzymes which I said, they are usually imported. So they are again a very costly affair. So these are the two things which are adding to the cost of this whole thing. So which is why government is now trying to subsidize, and we are also trying to develop our own pre-treatment processes which require lesser energy and better catalysts, so that the whole process can be done in a more energy efficient and economical manner.
Okay, ma'am. Will ethanol have the same or better performance or efficiency than the conventional sources?
It is having similar octane number and everything as compared to gasoline. That is why we can blend up to 20% without having any modification in the engine. So it is similar to petrol. It is having all properties similar to petrol, up to 20% blending if we are able to do.
Okay, ma'am. In random genetic engineering, does the usage of chemicals affect the amount of product?
No, it does not affect the amount of product. So what happens is initially, so random genetic engineering is again an extension of evolutionary kind of a thing. So the more product you use, the more kind of changes can happen in the genome. So there are some numbers that, for every that one mutation can happen in, say, every 10,000 base pairs. So if you use more of the mutagen, you can increase the frequency of mutation. But at the same time, what happens is all these mutagens are actually lethal in nature. So they will also interfere. They will also not allow your organism to multiply. So therefore, a balance has to be achieved. And usually what we do in our lab is we start with a very low concentration and we gradually build up the concentration. Because if we start with high concentration in the beginning, all the cells as it is, they die off. Yeah.
Okay, ma'am. If ethanol concentration increases, being hydrophilic, wouldn't it cause corrosion? Will there be any solution to prevent it?
Sorry, can you please repeat? If ethanol concentration?
If ethanol concentration increases, being hydrophilic, wouldn't it cause corrosion? Will there be any solution to prevent it?
Yes, so that is what I said. Up to 20%, these problems are not an issue. Up to 20% ethanol blending, there are several cars. This has been demonstrated in many parts of the world as well. That up to 20% continuously it can operate. Beyond that, this hydrophilic nature of ethanol is a problem definitely, and it can lead to inhibition in combustion products which can be corrosive in nature. So up to 20%, there is no problem.
Okay, ma'am. We in India use lignocellulosic biomass for ethanol production, but what about in other countries?
So in other countries also, so in Brazil, for example, they are using food crops. So in Brazil, the advantage is that they have a lot of land and the population is comparatively lesser. So they have huge areas of land in which they grow sugarcane and they use that sugarcane for ethanol production. And they are generating huge amounts of ethanol, and that is why their cars are running on 100% ethanol. Uh, but for as far as other countries are concerned, people are gradually moving towards 2G ethanol only because again, when we talk about sugarcane, it is a very it requires a lot of water. And growing sugarcane also takes a lot of time. It takes almost 11 months for one crop. So you have to engage your field for that long, and you also have to give so much of water. So growing sugarcane is not feasible in the long run. So people are trying to move towards other residues like rice straw, wheat straw, cotton stalk, etc.
Okay, ma'am, this is a continuation of the same question. What is the purity
Yeah.
of ethanol produced in comparison to other countries? And what about the concentration of biomass that is needed to produce ethanol?
Yeah, so concentration of biomass. So as I said, from 1 ton of biomass, 1 ton of rice straw, we can make around 220 to 230 liters of ethanol. And this ethanol will be, we can go up to 99.9% by using distillation and molecular sieve technology. We are able to achieve that kind of purity. And this is on par with what other countries are already achieving.
Okay, ma'am. Next question. Do you think fusion proteins method in genetic engineering could be implemented practically in the future?
So fusion, so implemented practically, I hope you're talking about, I think you're talking about commercial application. So commercial application looks a long way off because there are several challenges associated. So genetically modified organisms and their use is still, there is not much clarity. So how it will be implemented, we need to see. But fusion proteins, they appear to be better because we can have two activities with the same protein, and therefore it will be although there is initially the development of the strain will be more difficult and it will be more challenging, but once you have it, it will be a good option. Yes.
Okay, ma'am. Instead of obtaining ethanol from plantations, is there any work going into completely synthetically producing it?
Completely synthetically, so yes, ethanol is also made from petrochemical route as well, so it is a byproduct of the petrochemical industry also. So naturally, so what we are getting now in our whatever we are getting now for industrial applications, not for edible consumption, what we are getting for industrial applications, quite a lot of it is actually coming from petrochemical route. Yes.
Okay, ma'am. Which would be what would be the ecological implications from using ethanol as a fuel? Does it mean we would need more extensions of plantations? And what about gas emissions?
Okay, so ethanol is a very clean fuel. Complete combustion of ethanol will produce only CO2 and water. So it is a very clean fuel. It does not leave any residue. That is the advantage of ethanol, and that is why ethanol is being promoted. And we are not talking about any extra plantation. What we're talking about is agri residue from what is already being cultivated. So right now, what we're talking about when we talk about rice and wheat, etc., we are only using the grain part of it. Whatever the plant is there, that is usually like, for example, in Punjab and Haryana, what happens is they kind of burn it off, and which leads to smog problems in Delhi. So this has this has a lot of implication as socio-economic implication also. It leads to more pollution in the Delhi zone. It leads to other problems like lung disorders. It leads to even cancer because those high carbon content is potentially carcinogenic in nature. So we are not talking about any extra plantation. We are seeing whatever existing agricultural cultivation is happening, that is as it is generating enough material, enough surplus biomass, which will be used for ethanol production.
Okay, ma'am. How can the technique of random genetic engineering be applied in the ethanol extraction process?
No, ethanol extraction is a chemical process. The genetic engineering will not be used over there. Ethanol extraction is happening by distillation. It is a purely chemical process.